We don't need to understand why God does the things he does, because it's not for us to understand. It's not a three-dimensional God that we serve and that we love. God's far bigger than us. The word forgiven, to me, I immediately think about Jesus and everything that he did so that everything that I've done can be erased. Every sin that I've committed is forgivable because of Jesus. And I didn't know that because I grew up in a family that didn't go to church. I had one of those perfect little American families. You know, as far as I knew, there was nothing wrong with my family. And when I was 12, I got some news from my mom when I got back from science camp that my dad was moving out and she was with his best friend, his fishing buddy. As a 12-year-old, that rocked me. When Daisy was born, I had that moment where when she was born and the doctor put her in my arms and I held her, I had that moment that people talk about, you know, the birth of your child happens, where it changed me. And it was immediate that I was a different person at that point. And what I mean by that is I didn't immediately stop using or start going to church, but every decision that I made, I first thought about, how is this going to affect my kids? So every decision I made from that day on, it wasn't just about me. It was a battle between, is this decision going to affect my daughters? Which changed everything about who I was. So after Daisy was about 1.5 years old, I really got deep into my addiction. And I sit down with my dad and he looks me in the eyes and he says, "What are you doing?" And, you know, young 20-something-year-old kid, I go, "What do you mean?" And I kind of smile. "What are you doing with your life?" I say, "I don't know, Pop, I'm just living." He says, "No, you're not. You're dying." And at that moment, I break down. And that was my moment. And I just broke down and I just told him, "Pops, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to get out of this." He said, I talked to your cousin, my cousin Ryan. He was a pastor. He lives in Virginia. They're willing to take you, but you can't do drugs, you can't drink, and you have to go to church on Sunday. I said, "Well, no, I don't want to do that." At this time, I think I thought I was an atheist. I really didn't know what I was, but I certainly wasn't a Christian. You know, it's the hardest thing for an addict the day they decide to change. I'm living with my cousin Ryan and his wife Joy, and my Aunt Eileen is living there, and their only rules are that I go to church and I don't use drugs. I was really skeptical. For me to believe in this so-called God and the power of this so-called God, I needed to see and feel a tangible thing. I asked my Aunt Eileen, I told her I wanted to accept Jesus into my heart. And we did it right there in her little apartment. And I didn't really feel much. And that's where I go back to, you know, I thought I was going to feel something like smack me on the forehead and all of a sudden I was going to be a different guy. And that didn't happen. But once I became a Christian, that's when the devil started to really attack me. I hadn't seen either of my girls in months and months, and I thought that I was okay. So I decided to quit my job and I was going to move back home. So Daisy was with me 90% of the time then. You know, some things started to happen with Daisy. So we take her to the doctor, they do a CAT scan, and within hours, our world is turned upside down. There's a mass on her brain, and they want to rush her by ambulance immediately to Lucille Packard, which is Stanford's Children's Hospital. So everything's a blur. She gets on the ambulance, and we all head up there, and immediately they perform brain surgery on her, and you know, this is my little girl, and she's 3, and she's got this long hair, and they cut half of her hair off, and they you know, make this incision down her head, and they pull out the tumor where it's located is at the top of her brain and her spine, where the spinal fluid you know, comes down, and they take as much as they can of the tumor out, but they can't get it all because of where it's located. You know, my faith at that point is totally shaken. I don't understand how, if there's a God, how can this happen to a little girl? How? You know, it doesn't make any sense to me. So I'm angry again. I'm really mad. I'm upset. I feel like, you know, the only good thing that I ever did in my life is being taken away from me when I try to change and when I want to be a better person. Why is this happening, you know? And finally, they send us home right before Christmas. That's our Christmas present that year. You know, and it's amazing when a little kid can be as sick as my little girl was. They're the ones who keep everything together. They're just happy. They're resilient. It's just amazing to spend the time we spent in that hospital and watch all those little kids that are sick and dying, and the joy that those kids have, you know, over just being alive. It's just, you know, when you look back on it now, it's really encouraging. And I did the next 24, 25 months in prison while my kid was sick. You know, I couldn't be there for my daughter when she needed me. That was a pretty spiritual time for me, where I was able to really reflect on who I was and who God was. And you know, anyone that's done any amount of time in jail or prison knows that you read a lot. That's just one of the things you do. Well, I read the Bible a lot when I was in there. But this thing started to happen inside of me where I started to pray. And I started to pray for Daisy's healing. And I started to pray for strength. And just, you know, kind of growing in my faith, kind of all by myself. The news that I was getting from my dad was that everything was going good, and they were optimistic. And, you know, 3 or 4 months before I was set, you know, to get out and be able to go home, I was on the phone with my dad, and being the guy he is, he goes, "I got to tell you something." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "She's not going to make it." I go, "What do you mean?" He says, "Man, you know, she's got 6 months to live." And that crushed me, you know, because I had all this faith, and I thought because I was reading the Bible and because I was praying, I thought that's why she was getting better. I was just heartbroken. And I was so mad. I was so mad. And I didn't understand, and it didn't seem fair to me that that little girl that never had sinned in her life was going to die. You know, and I'm just really spiritually battling. I don't know that I even believe in God at that point when I'm supposed to get out. I'm so confused. I don't know that I was a believer. There was so much doubt, you know. I mean, how could I, right? You know, how could I be a believer? I get off that plane and I'm walking, and I believe I walked to an escalator. She didn't look anything like I remember her. She was so sick. She could barely talk. It was obvious to me that she was dying. That was the moment that the reality of that slapped me so hard across the face that I couldn't deny it. But I had to stay strong for her. I couldn't just start crying because she was so happy to see her daddy. She missed me so much. And we got in that car and we drove to to Oakland, to the halfway house. And I had to get out and leave and go into this halfway house. And I had to leave my little girl. And that was tough. That was really tough. Because all I wanted to do was hug on her and love her and tell her that I love her and never let her go. Because at that point, I knew that tomorrow wasn't promised. And you know, when they say, you know, tomorrow's not promised and don't take today for granted, there's never a time when you realize that more than when you're losing something so special. And there was nothing more that I wanted than to spend those last days with my little girl. There was nothing more that I needed. than to spend those last days. And so hospice intervened, and so we spent the last, I want to say it was 8 or 9 days in that little room. And this little girl, because of where the tumor was on her brain, she couldn't speak hardly. She could barely acknowledge. There was several days where at the end where she didn't say anything. She couldn't talk. She was almost brain dead. And I would just rub ice on her lips and just sing to her and tell her that I loved her. And so I had a lot of time to question God and who He was. And, I was really mad. I was really mad. I didn't understand it. And the last morning, my mom and I, we kind of said, it's getting close. I think it's going to happen. And my mom was in the other room, and I was sitting there, and I had my head next to Daisy's here. And I was just looking at her in her brain dead eyes. And she looked right at me. She said, "Daddy, can I go?" And I started to cry. I said, "Yeah, baby, you go." And I held her while she gasped for air. And it's amazing because without that moment, my faith would have been shattered. I probably never would have stepped foot in a church again, ever. But because of that moment, there was no denying a God. There was no denying. I didn't understand why it was happening. I was still upset. But I knew there was a God, because He gave me what I needed at that moment. And so we buried her, and I had a big decision to make. Do I go to church or to the bar? And I decided to go to church on that next Sunday. My buddy Joe, a lifelong friend of mine, he wasn't a church guy. He said, "Hey, I'll go with you." And we went to Century Assembly, and we sat way up in the top. And I stood up for worship, and I raised my arms, and I praised God. And I did that because I knew that He was almighty. There was no doubt in my mind. My name's Kevin Eisert, and I am forgiven.